Welcome to another Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. It couldn't be prettier out these windows. And the view at these windows is best explained by our Commodore. Come on up, Paul Heineken. Welcome, Paul. All these pretty boats out there.
What you're seeing out the window is a world sailing event called the Nations Cup. And it's the amateur world match racing championship that happens every 3, or in this case, 4 years. It's a really special event. We had the practice yesterday, opening ceremony last night. There are 20 teams from 12 countries here. And they're all being hosted by our members, many on boats down in the club. They vary in age. They're not all kids. There's some real adults out there sailing too. They've qualified by their country, so they're not representing a club, they're representing their country. And everybody on the boat is a representative and a citizen of that country. So it's going all the way through Sunday. A lot of races. We have 2 courses, one on the west, one on the east, to keep things going. And, oh, that's right, and just fire away with some slides.
This is the competitors.
Yeah, thank you. I got ahead of myself. So this title slide here, these are the competitors, and there's no way you can read this, so pick up a brochure, and you can, they're all around the club, and you can read about them. Some very accomplished sailors here. And this is what I was mentioning already, that Nicole Brault won this event 4 years ago in Vladivostok, Russia. And she's here on her home court to sail again on the J22s that she's used to. So we'd have to consider her a favorite. There's another American men's team. They come from Newport, Rhode Island, Pearson Potts. And then next slide. And then we also have, as we said here, the Kiwi team that finished 5th at the Congressional Cup last week, which is another very big match racing championship down in LA. And if it blows like it did yesterday afternoon and is predicted to blow every day, the Kiwi team in the opening ceremonies last night was full of large men. And they should do very well in these J22s later in the day. So that's it. That's what you're seeing. Come on down and watch it all week long. You really need a program to know who's against whom, and they're available also.
You can get those at the front desk.
Yeah, and this is at the front desk. So thanks a lot. And what I should have said first is, on behalf of the flag officers, the board of directors, and all the members of the St. Francis Yacht Club, we welcome you and all of the people online out there in cyberspace watching us and this event out our window. So thanks very much, Ron.
Great, Paul. Thank you. Wonderful. Let's see a little bit about future programs. June 12th, come by. Luke Muller will be here to tell us how he's going to try to get the Olympic berth for the Finn. The last year the Finn will be in the Olympics. Allison Langley, noted yachting photographer, will be here on June the 5th. Terry Hutchinson, skipper and executive director of the American Magic Challenge for the America's Cup, hosted by the New York Yacht Club. He'll be here on May 29th. We'll also have Alan Edwards will be here on May 15th to talk all about how his L36, Lapworth 36 website has now grown with more than 10,000 visitors to be in public use. So it's not just his fleet. All kinds of fleets are benefiting from his current tables, his wind tables, and so on. Bill Lynn, a managing director of the Hair Shop Museum, will be here in May. Channing Robertson from Stanford, the physics professor, will be here to talk about what nature can teach us about speed. Nick Poulos, a sailor who also is a calligrapher, will be here to talk about From the White House to Whitecaps, a calligrapher's journey to the White House. He lives in Northern California these days. And next week, Patrick Hunt, the famed, in fact, Stanford professor, will be here to talk about Hannibal's tactical surprises, nautical surprises, and tactics offshore, and the dawn of biological warfare. So great programs coming up. a little bit about our speaker today. She started sailing as a young child. Her family sailed, and so she grew up in a sailing family. Her first memorable event was at age 7, sailing in a Cal 27 pop top and cruising around in it. At age 25, they bought a boat and started racing, she and her hubby, and they bought a Thunderbird. Those who know what a Thunderbird was, chine bottom, 26-foot long boat up in Seattle where it's not as windy as it is down here. They raced it, and things changed in 1998 when they were at Antigua Race Week and racing around and saw cruisers and got this beautiful feeling when they watched the cruisers. They were on a Swan 62, but they thought, we got to try this cruising thing. So that very year, they immediately went out and bought themselves a 31-foot, or they started cruising, and then took off in 2000, and from 2000 until 2000 did one lap of the Pacific, from Seattle to New Zealand to Japan and back. And there are lots of us who resist that temptation. Once, years ago, as I was coming down the trip from Marin County to here, a dear friend, Pete Sutter, who is a sailmaker, said to me, "Ron, what are you doing this afternoon?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I got a schedule full of stuff." He said, "Skip it. You're leaving today." And I said to Pete Sutter, "What do you mean I'm leaving today?" He said, "You're leaving today. You're going cruising." And I said, "Where?" And he said, "That's the point. You don't know where. You have the best time if you don't know where. Just leave today." All the way to the Yacht Club, Pete Sutter tried to persuade me, quit all of what you're doing, put your calendar aside, take off and go cruising. I didn't do that, but our speaker today did. Wendy Hinman, tell us all about it.
Well, I answered that siren call. How many of you have felt that siren call? Yeah. How many of you have answered it? All right. Love it. Okay. So we dream of tropical escape, and we imagine weather just like this. And it's not always like that, but that's part of the fun. So I grew up sailing pretty much from a very young age. My family was interested in boats, but then it really started in Hawaii when we bought a boat in the Hawaiian Islands and traveled all over the Hawaiian Islands. And I remember going offshore and between the islands, and my family, I pointed out a rock, and then that rock vanished, and we realized that it was a whale, and my mother was not quite as comfortable with that idea. The whale was way bigger than our little Cal 27. But we had all these books aboard, Survive the Savage Sea, Adrift and Afloat, and I thought they sounded great. I mean, disasters, whatever, it all sounded exciting to me. But probably explains why my mother was not interested in going offshore like my dad was. But when I got older, I met this handsome fellow and discovered that he had actually sailed around the world as a kid. He left from San Francisco, circumnavigated the world, and came back to San Francisco. And it hit the papers. It was big news because they were shipwrecked partway through the voyage. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. But he was interested in going again anyway, despite being shipwrecked. And I kept peppering him with more and more questions. So we got married, kind of had this idea that we might go off sailing at some point in time. And then, as I said, or as Ron said, we did Antigua Race Week and met all these cruisers and said, all right, now's the time, let's do it. We'd been racing, but we'd been kind of saving our kitty for that time when we found that perfect boat. So we started shopping for boats. We looked everywhere, and our requirements kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller because the budget was not real large. We were in our 30s, and we weren't millionaires or anything. So we found this one online designed by Tom Wiley, and it was small but sturdy and had done lots of interesting things already. And so we bought it. Except my husband couldn't actually stand up straight in the boat. Kind of a problem if you're living aboard. But he thought, it's not going to be a problem. He said, well, I can stand up here, standing under the one open hatch. which you don't tend to do every day, all day, but fortunately you spend a lot of time outside. When we bought the boat, we thought we were just going to go for maybe a year or two, and we went for 7. And I think the only reason we ended up coming back was because my husband was like, you know what, I'm going to look like Quasimodo if we don't do something about this problem. So we took off on this open-ended voyage. Here's a little bit about the boat, Tom Wiley design. I'm so psyched he's here today. 31 feet, 9.5-foot beam, 6.5-foot draft, loaded. 8,000 pounds, so it does not carry a lot. We probably had thousands of pounds of books alone, but anyway, that's our weakness, our addiction. 10 gallons of diesel in the tanks. With jerry cans, we could do 18, so we didn't motor far. Water, 45 gallons kept us busy for about 3 weeks. We could catch a lot, fortunately, from the sky. And there's lots of that salty stuff out there. Propane, 20 pounds, would keep us busy for about 6 weeks. Here's our interior, which is very handy, as you can see. Everything's convenient. You can change the oil in the living room, the dining room, the bedroom, and the kitchen all at the same time. You know, those small boats are really quite handy. And sometimes it was my own little private torture chamber. So here's what it looks like going underway. Partway through our voyage, we built this 2-part nesting dinghy designed by Danny Green, a chameleon. And pretty fun. We were able to go sail around with that and explore outside the big boat. So we headed down the coast. We spent some time here wandering all over San Francisco Bay and spent some time in the San Francisco Marina enjoying the sights. And then headed on down to Mexico and went up into the Sea of Cortez. As you can see, there's some gorgeous spots up there, and many of which we had all to ourselves. In this first bay up on the upper left-hand side of the screen, we sat in that bay in our little dinghy, and we were surrounded by dolphins. They were all working together to corral the fish together as a unit. We saw sea snakes and turtles and pelicans and just so much sea life that there was this free show of nature every single day, and it was just so exciting, and I just loved it more and more and more. There was so much to do. Every day was different. One of the amazing things that happened while we were in Mexico is that we saw the boat that my husband had sailed around the world on in 1973 to 1978. And it's like meeting the member of the family that I hadn't met before. So I've been hearing these stories because I'd been married to my husband for a while, 12 years by the point we took off to go sailing. And, you know, everyone would say, oh, you remember the time when, you know, Abdul got lost in the Suez Canal? And you remember the time when the boat was sinking off of Israel? And you remember the shipwreck? And you know, just all these tantalizing things. And so, you know, I got this great education in how not to sail around the world, I guess you could say, and got to benefit from all those lessons. But we were in the marina in La Paz, and I had come out of the marina bathroom, and my husband said, oh my gosh, the Vela is here. And I said, what? And he pointed at a mast several hundred yards away and said, the Vela's here. And I said, yeah, right. Sure enough, it was the Vela. He'd spent a lot of time up that mast, could recognize it from quite a long ways away. And the boat owner that had bought it from them was indeed aboard. And so we got to share stories with him. I think he bought the boat mostly for the stories because it wasn't in such great shape when they got home after their voyage. So we carried on through the South Pacific to the Marquesas, beautiful high islands, volcanic islands, on through the Tuamotus where you've got these coral reefs and the volcanic part has sunken back into the ocean. So all that's left for navigation is looking for a palm tree and trying to go between the right group of palm trees on the entrance to the island, which can be a little hairy. This is called the Tuamotus, the dangerous archipelago, which my husband's family decided to skip because they didn't want to run on a reef. Well, they ran on a reef anyway, but we got to see it with the help of GPS. We explored all sorts of caves and waterfalls, So you can see our version of what's big enough is a little bit different. He's a little bit bigger than I am. So I felt completely comfortable inside of Valela, and he was a little bit more cramped. Niue is an interesting island. We would have never visited any other way than by boat. It's a population of about 1,100 people, northeast of New Zealand, and it's basically created by coral creatures. We went on to Fiji and had a much better landfall than my husband's family did. We actually got to arrive at daylight, although we had a few shenanigans that made our arrival a little more exciting, but little detail to go into today. But we got to see much more of the area because Garth's family was busy rebuilding their boat after getting shipwrecked when they were in Fiji. So their view was of the boatyard. We were on the hunt for the most beautiful waterfalls, the tall, narrow ones, the wide ones. There are so many beautiful waterfalls. And when you're getting all hot and sweaty, your reward is swimming in beautiful, you guys are dining, beautiful water, fresh water, and getting a nice rinse. We went to a beautiful water slide in Fiji. And if you look really closely in this picture, you can see Garth getting one of those rides that you just can't help but say, whee! And it was different. On a real rainy day, it was a faster ride than otherwise. We went on to Vanuatu, where we met families that had very little interaction with the outer world. Cute little guy and better paddler than I am. And many cultures that function just as they did thousands of years ago. This is the more modest dressed group of people that we met in these islands. There's what I call the why bother school of dress, where, it just doesn't cover very much. And when you're meeting everyone in the entire village and they're dressed in practically nothing, it's a little bit of an interesting experience. We went on to New Zealand. My husband's family never got to New Zealand because they had a little bit of a hiccup and skipped New Zealand for the boatyard. But we got to continue our search for the most beautiful places to explore. Here is a quick and dirty version of our voyage. And as we got to New Zealand, my husband said, I don't need to keep recreating this journey that I took as a kid. We went to so many of the places that he had gone with his family, many of the capital cities, but we also got to see some of the areas outside of the capital cities that they never got to see because navigation was a little more primitive, using celestial navigation at that point. So he said, why don't we go to Japan? Nobody ever sails to Japan. Well, I know why. It's not the easiest place to go sailing, and it's very much off the beaten track. We encountered very few other boats on much of this journey from New Zealand northward of the Solomon Islands. It's just off the beaten track. There's not much information, and you really are doing navigation and exploring a bit like you did back in the old days. And after we wrecked all of our electronics when we were in the Solomon Islands, it felt a lot like the old days because we wrecked the GPSs, the depth sounder, everything. The radios, we were pretty much like they were back in the 70s. Fortunately, we had the sextant on board, but we were able to borrow a GPS and carry on. So we spent several thousand miles sailing out of our way to go somewhere where we could fix the boat, all that equipment, because we thought it would add to our quality of life, and it did. So we sailed on to Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, and were able to use the U.S. Postal Service and work for a little while to top up the cruising kitty, and then carried on through the Western Pacific, tracing a bit of World War II history up through the Western Pacific and some of the big battle sites. When we got to Kwajalein, we had to figure out how to get the boat out of the water to fix all of that equipment. We wrecked the transducer, and so if we wanted to have a depth sounder and speedo and all of that kind of thing, we had to figure out how to get the boat out of the water on a remote island without much in the way of facilities. Fortunately, my husband had been perfecting that skill. He had a little bit of practice as a 14-year-old shipwrecked boy. So we built this thing in Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, and it is completely adjustable. We call it well, anyway, never mind. I'll forget you can read about what I called it. So it's completely adjustable, can handle all sorts of different kinds of boats, and it is still there today. We sold it for $10,000, and it's now a business hauling boats out in the Marshall Islands. So we left a little bit of a legacy behind when we continued sailing on. We went to some places we would never have gone any other way. We went to Hong Kong and the Philippines and so forth, but we went to a place called Lanyu in Taiwan, also known as Orchid Island, and we weren't officially supposed to stop there, but you know, when you're a yacht in distress, you can stop places sometimes, and we told them that we needed water. Well, we always needed water, but there was a gale to the north of us that we were anxious to avoid. And they let us sail in, and they handed us this box full of water, bottled water, and we filled our tanks, and we thought, uh-oh, now they're going to make us go out there in that gale. But fortunately, we were able to stay and explore this fascinating place and fascinating culture, which very few people know about. We got to see some of the old-style canoes that they carved and painted, and they would go out on these into the Taiwan Strait, which, if you know anything about weather, is a nasty stretch of water, and they would catch flying fish in those tiny little boats. They're so skinny that there's a rock on either side to keep it from falling over. So if you look really carefully, you can see that rock on both sides. And they would catch flying fish, and then they would dry it in the sun to get them through the wintertime. We went on to Japan, the land of the rising sun, our final destination. We're a little bit later than usual, later than we expected. We were about 2 years later, but we finally got there and got to reunite with some people that we had met through the America's Cup in New Zealand when we were down there. And they were covering the America's Cup and wrote some articles about us in Kazi magazine. So there are several magazine articles about us written in kanji and Japanese, which I can't really tell you what they say, but based on what people comment on, we can kind of ferret out what it says. We did 31-foot boat. We did 7 years, and yes, we are still married. We just celebrated 30 years, believe it or not, and we still like each other. And we are planning another adventure. So part of the reason we came back is my husband really wanted to design and build his own boat. So unfortunately, our next boat is not going to be a Time Wiley design. It's going to be a Garth Wilcox design, but he's a naval architect trained at MIT, so he had to put some of those skills to work doing other things besides just steel vessels. So sometimes it was not easy, as you probably have surmised. Life looked like this quite often, and healing like that means that I need to be kind of like Wonder Woman to make dinner, and sometimes power bars were what we had for dinner after I sprinkled spaghetti all over the entire interior of the boat. And then we got to eat power bars, and I still had to clean it up. We had all sorts of challenges. This is the North Pacific, probably one of our bigger ones, and you can see there's a little bit of a diversion on the chart there on the North Pacific, where we had to sail around a typhoon. And suddenly we got way out there in the middle, and there was no wind for thousands of miles after we'd sailed around these horrendous waves and crazy weather. And then there we sat and wondered if we were going to run out of our supplies before we made it all the way across. We had all kinds of ships and typhoons that we thought would turn our boat into kindling. But we had vessels that we heard but never saw, vessels we smelled but never saw, and some vessels that I thought might be the last thing that I ever saw. That 49-day nonstop across the North Pacific definitely was something I would call character building. And despite that, I want to go again. I'm very excited to go again. My husband's excited to go again. We came back and we sort of said, okay, it's a race. I was going to write a book about our journey, Tightwads on the Loose, and my husband was going to design the boat and build it, in this amount of time. Well, this book now has been out for several years, won all sorts of prizes and things, and we're still building. Oh, so this one is about our journey around the Pacific, 7 years, 34,000 miles on the 31-footer. And so I said, okay, well, while you're building the boat, maybe I will work on the next obvious story, which is the story about your family's journey around the world, because it is so intriguing. Imagine being shipwrecked on an uninhabited island, hitting the reef at 4 o'clock in the morning, a year into your journey, and wondering if that's the end of your voyage, and gee, it was nice while it lasted. But we kind of have a big hole in the boat. And evacuating and discovering that you're probably going to have to leave it out there. So they think that's going to be the end of their voyage. But the boat did not always look so horrible. It was actually a pretty fancy boat compared to Valela. It was a 40-foot double-ender main Pinky, very, very heavy. When we were shopping for boats, my husband said, I sailed around the world in a tub, and I'm not doing that again. So we wanted a boat that was a well-sailed boat, and we did find one. The Tom Wiley design was so awesome. In fact, I would go off on that one again right now because I'm only 5'4", and it fits me just fine. So they had a lot fewer boats to choose from back in the 70s. So when they were looking for boats, they found this one. The family that was selling it had a teenage daughter that didn't want to go, and so Garth's family got this great boat for a good price. And it had all these wonderful amenities. It had a fireplace. They were going to go to the tropics. But, you don't always really know what you don't know until you get a little bit further in. So they set off. My husband was 13, his sister was 11, and sailed for Hawaii and started to learn all the things they didn't know, like if you got to take the shackle off the main or you'll lose it up the rig, and lovely things like that. On down to the Marquesas, got to meet Daniel and Antoinette, who have since become quite famous, and many people have met them on their cruises. This was them a little bit longer ago. Got to meet a man who inspired their voyage. Tom Neal had written a book called An Island to Oneself, and he was back on the island, Suaro, in the Cook Islands when they passed through. And so they got to meet this man who had inspired them. They went on to Tonga, where they got to see a whale get pulled in. They still caught whales back in that day. All this time, they were managing to sail using a sextant. So navigation was not quite as exact. You know how your GPS will triangulate using the satellites? Well, they're doing this with the stars. And they know where they were maybe a few minutes or an hour ago before they started calculating, except that sometimes you get swept north into a reef. So they hit the reef in Fiji in 1974. It was in a bunch of papers around here. And they abandoned ship and took their last photograph of the boat, or so they thought, and got onto that island. But they're not the giving up kind of people. They are very stubborn. Believe me, I know. I'm related to them all. And they managed to get that boat off the reef. They almost gave up. The boat was out on the reef for 6 weeks. It was grinding a huge hole in the boat. And the quick and dirty is, yes, indeed, they did sail around the world. They did pull the boat off, but there is so much to how that happened. Getting the boat off the reef. And here's the repairing the boat in Fiji under crazy, hot, humid conditions, typhoons rolling through. But they did get sailing again, headed on to Australia, got rolled in a storm, punched in the windows, and they said, that's it, we're giving up. This is the voyage of 9 lives. They kept wanting to give up, I don't know how many times, but they said, okay, well, we'll keep going, but we're not going to go around the Cape of Storms. So they decided to go through the Suez Canal. And in the Suez, or go through the Red Sea, and in the Red Sea, they said, that's it, we're done, we're giving up. I can't do this anymore. And they say, well, next port, we're going to sell the boat. And they get to Sudan, and they look there, and they go, I don't think there's going to be too many boat buyers here. Nor is there a West Marine and much of a place to fix this boat. But they carry on, and young Garth Wilcox, my husband, kind of took over as captain. His parents had a number of meltdowns and moments when they thought they couldn't do it anymore. And this young lad rose to the occasion and MacGyvered his way the rest of the way around the world. And I got to benefit from all that experience. Here he is circumnavigating across the Pacific, circumnavigating across the Atlantic, doing celestial navigation. Say that fast. The engine dies, everything's breaking. This is just a crazy, challenging voyage. And as they're sailing up the coast without an engine because it stopped working, people thought that maybe they were lost because they were so long overdue. They were running out of food. They didn't have enough food. And the rig started coming apart. So off the coast, there were entries in the log that said something like, or Davy Jones' locker. They did manage to survive, and the boat did manage to make it all the way up. Part of the rig is missing here, but it's not in this photo. And their arrival came with a media maelstrom, just crazy, crazy media. They were on San Francisco this morning and some news programs, and it hit papers in New York, LA, Geneva, Toronto, just all over the place. And those are the ones that I know about. This family that thought that they were going to die after 87 days is suddenly, staring at the bright lights and getting asked crazy questions by Maury Povich like, were you worried about the Bermuda Triangle? Well, no, because they didn't go anywhere near the Bermuda Triangle. But that was the time. This is the family at the end of their voyage back in 1978, got in July. And that is the kind of the quick version of this crazy story. It's gotten wonderful reviews, Cruising World, sailing, riveting, possible to put down. Every writer loves to hear that. And other nice reviews for Tightwads as well. And you can take copies home today if you're interested. So, yeah. How to do a huge journey in, 25 minutes?
Wonderful, and welcome again to our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Our speaker today, Wendy Hinman, has sailed around the Pacific and has written 2 books, one including about her husband's trip around the world. It's wonderful to have you here, and we have in our company the designer of the boat she went with, Tom Wiley, and we have other cruising couples. Let me see some hands of other cruising couples. The Fosses are here. They cruise across the Atlantic. Bruce Monroe and Lynn are here. They've cruised quite a bit. So
Bruce Monroe is a family name. Garth's family remembered coming up here when Bruce Monroe was part of the club.
Bruce Commodore, Staff Commodore Bruce Monroe, right here.
Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Yeah.
So, holy cow, 31-foot boat out there in the ocean for 34,000 miles. Can you tell us the most scared moment of the trip?
How long do we have?
Right. Well, give us the most scared moment, and then depending on time, we'll ask about more.
One that really, really sticks out in my mind is on the North Pacific, where you've got 50-degree temperatures and you've got water that's about the same temperature. We had a ship appear out of nowhere, and it was very, very heavy fog. We could barely see our own bow for weeks. And the fog cleared momentarily, and there was this huge orange ship coming right at me. And I didn't have the radio up in and on in the cockpit because we hadn't seen anything for weeks, and it was moist, and we didn't want to wreck the radio. And he disappeared out of the fog and then reappeared and disappeared. So I didn't want to take my eyes off of him because I was mentally gauging where he was. And so I just did a quick pound on the deck to wake up Garth, who was sleeping below, sound sleep. Fortunately, it was daylight, so we could actually see what was going on. But he came up, and I just pointed at this orange ship, and he got on the radio and called that ship. And it appeared and disappeared out of the fog several times, and then suddenly we saw, as we finished the message, orange ship, do you see us? We're right off your bow. We're on a collision course. We heard, and then he diverted away, and we just thought, oh my gosh. I mean, we were in the North Pacific. Nobody would have even known what had happened to us. We might have been debris on the bulb of that ship, or maybe not. So our radios hadn't been working for a while, and so we weren't not even in radio communication at that point. So
How often during the trip
Long
did you
distance.
have no radio communication?
quite a bit of the time. When we left, we
For some of the
had a
time.
receive-only SSB, and then we bought one in New Zealand. So we were able to communicate, and we got all excited. We were able to do email for a little while, and then it died again. And it's a very corrosive, cold, wet environment, and so you're asking a lot of your equipment. And on a little boat, it's a little closer to the water inside than it is otherwise on a larger boat. And so they didn't hold up, and we ended up losing our radio communications long distance several times.
So now, did you have did you have an autopilot?
No autopilot. We had a wind vane, and that worked quite well. Well, actually, we did have an autopilot.
A wind vane that could turn the tiller.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so you had a manual autopilot.
Yes.
Okay.
Servo pendulum.
Okay, and what kind of watch system did you use as you sailed?
We started out with 3 hours on, 3 hours off, which is what Garth's family had done. Of course, there were 4 of them. And we discovered that we were much more rested if we did 4-hour watches. So we switched to 4-hour watches. And I thought I would be watching the clock and counting the minutes, but I discovered that I was more well rested, and so it didn't seem quite like an eternity.
Now, I'm going to keep asking questions, but if I see a question, Daru's going to bring the mic to you, and we'll give you the question. And on Facebook, we have a question. Julia.
Yes, Kimberly Paternoster sounds very interested and loves what you're doing. Wonderful. Loved hearing about how you sailed on a 31-foot boat. I want to know how much it cost per year and how you supported yourself. And
Good
how did
question.
you and your husband deal with it if you needed to get away from each other on a 31-foot boat?
Well, we had a house that brought in rental income, and that was about $1,000 net a month that once we covered all the expenses. And so that was pretty much our budget. We did have savings, but we dipped into them quite heavily the first couple of years, and we had to cool our jets a little bit. And when we spent too much, we'd go to a remote anchorage and wait for the next rent check to come in and try not to spend too much. So that was about $33 a day, and that included boat maintenance as well as communications costs and all the extra fun stuff. And we ended up stopping in the Marshall Islands after we wrecked all of our equipment and topping off the kitty for just a little bit. Then, as far as getting away from each other, well, 31 feet, it can seem like a long way away, at the bow and the cockpit. Or books, good books, we'd be in different worlds. And you get really good at letting a lot of stuff roll off when the only person who knows where you are and is partially helpful for making sure you stay safe. You You don't sweat the small stuff. Toothpaste, cap, who cares?
Helps put things in perspective. So how did money get transferred to you? If you're in the South Pacific and the rent check for $1,000 clears your bank, how did you get access down there? I assume it was auto deposit.
We did a whole bunch of different techniques for that. We ended up having traveler's checks. We had credit cards. We had cash aboard hidden in various places. We had an ATM. And during the time that we were gone, it really changed what techniques worked depending on which country we were in. And ATMs were much more popular later in the game, although in Japan there were only certain ATMs that would work, and we were informed by our bank that credit cards were not going to work in Japan, and we were not able to use credit cards in Japan. So we often would tell our bank through my mother, who was kind of our manager, where we were going to be so they could anticipate where to allow the expenses to come in from. And we were less able to use traveler's checks later on. They're just getting less and less popular these days.
Now, did I see 45 gallons of water? Is that the number that I saw?
Yeah.
And so how many days was that, and how did you collect water? How would you get more water?
We had an awning that we built on the foredeck, and we just bought one of those ubiquitous kinds of tarps that you can buy in any hardware store, and we had some clips that we bought at the boat show, and we clipped them on and held them to the lifelines, and then we poked a hole through that and put a through-hole fitting in, a couple of lines.
A through-hole fitting through the boat?
Through-hole fitting through the tarp.
Okay.
And then we had a hose attached to that we would run down into
So you collected water in the
jugs.
tarp into jugs.
Yeah.
Got it.
So we'd create a low spot, and then the water would just flow into those jugs. It was great. So when we were in the Solomon Islands, it rained a ton, and we were able to collect a lot of water, and we made ginger beer on rainy days. Turned a rainy day into fun.
How low did you ever get on water?
We bought water twice in 7 years. We bought it in Mexico. We bought one of those jugs, and we were able to get water for free, but once we tasted it in that place, we decided to empty our tanks completely, and we bought one of those water jugs that you get, for your office. And then in Tonga, they did not want to give us water because we didn't buy enough gas, because we didn't have big enough tanks to buy enough gas. So we bought water then. One time in the Tuamotus, we were worried about how low we were, and we were able to get a little tiny bit, like 5 gallons, from a boat that made water with a water maker, but it turned out we didn't actually need it. So
Now, food. How low did you get on food, and what were the circumstances where you got low on food ever?
Garth was really adamant that we have plenty of food. I think it has something to do with nearly starving off the coast of California, off the coast coming home. But we carried probably 3 to 6 months worth of dry goods, and then we carried lots of produce. And if you treat produce right and you keep it from bruising, you can keep produce quite a long time. So we would cushion it with towels and use baskets to sequester it and have things that get along together so that you don't have advanced ripening.
So give us some numbers. What could you keep for how long? How long? When you say produce, what kind of produce?
I had a jicama that I bought in Mexico, and they took it from me in New Zealand. So that was a 6-month-old jicama, and it was in perfect shape. So you can keep it quite a long time if you prepare. With eggs, we would flip them regularly, and if you flip them regularly, you could get those to go for 6 weeks or so. If you've bought them and they've already been refrigerated, the clock is ticking and it's shorter. So if you can buy them from a farm, they haven't been refrigerated, and that membrane on the outside is not compromised, basically. And if you can keep the yolk in the middle, you can keep it going. The key is keeping things from bruising and then throwing things away. If you see bruising or a mark or rot starting to happen, that's lunch or that's sayonara, baby.
So we have in our audience members from the early 50s, 52, I think. John and Mary Cumberpatch. And Mary has a question. Mary.
How often and to what extent were you accosted by pirates?
How often and to what extent? We had no issues with pirates. I was a little bit frightened on one occasion, but what I've grown to realize is that people are warm and friendly most everywhere, and the attitude that you come across with usually comes back in kind. And so if you're warm and welcoming, you'll get that in reply. And often the officials don't have enough money for real uniforms, and so you assume the best, and that's usually what you get. We didn't get things taken from us. We locked the boat on 2 occasions, San Diego and and the Philippines. We locked the boat. Usually we left the boat open. Getting that circulation was important. Maybe it's not as safe as it was, but I think it's probably pretty safe still.
So ever, anybody, did you fall overboard? Did he fall overboard?
Fortunately, we didn't really fall. There was one moment on the North Pacific where he was pulling in the sail on the bow, and he came back, and he'd gone overboard very briefly and come right back on. And when he got back to the cockpit, I hadn't realized that he had that moment of knowing that he was over the side, but he came right back on board. And so, I didn't have that scary moment. Yeah.
Can you do celestial navigation?
We studied celestial navigation. It was challenging to do in Seattle because we were doing it in the wintertime, and the sun is only so high for so long, for about 20 minutes from noon to 12:20. It was long enough, so to actually pass our course, we had to borrow each other's sites to have enough data for putting it together.
But both of you could do celestial.
Yeah, we both did. I have to say we cheated and we used GPS, but it's nice to know that you've got the skill if you need. The thing is, the GPS cost me $300 to buy, and they're cheaper now. And it cost me $300 to refurbish the sextant, to get it repainted and calibrated and cleaned and so forth. And the nautical almanacs cost $50 to $100 each year. Now, you can reuse them every 4th year, apparently, but we start doing the math, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to do the celestial navigation with the nautical almanac when you could just have a GPS. But it's a great skill to have.
Yes, we have another question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Could you say a little bit more about that rig that you built? Was it the Marshalls that used to haul the yacht?
Yes.
That looked like a project.
It was quite a project. In blistering hot sun and wool long pants, welding, and the first day the welding arced back and burned my husband's hand, and he was rushing to the hospital within a few minutes of doing that. He only had superficial burns, so he was back at it a couple of weeks later. But he is a naval architect, so this was his great engineering challenge, was to figure out how to make this thing adjustable so that it can handle a full-keeled boat that weighs 30,000 pounds and a fin-keeled boat with a transom-hung rudder that was 8,000 pounds. And those were the first 2 customers. So he and a buddy of his, talked about what parts they could get, and they were scrounging under bushes. They had wheel axles they were able to get that had been sunk in the lagoon a couple of years before. They'd been driven off the end of the pier or something. And so they were able to clean and go through all this stuff. And he must have redesigned this thing like 10 times, because he'd say, well, I need 2-inch pipe. And his buddy would say, well, I can get you 1-inch pipe, but I can't get you 2-inch pipe. So he'd redesign it to work with the pipe that he could get. And they were using discards from various projects on the island that didn't need them.
So what was the roughest weather you saw?
We saw some typhoons, so we saw some pretty rough weather. Generally speaking, we were in port more often when the rough weather happened. We tried to do that as much as possible, but it's essential to be able to sail your boat in all sorts of different conditions. We carried a Jordan series drogue, and we did not really have to use it. We had warps and so forth. And so we were planning for really rough weather. We practiced going out and putting the boat heave to so that we were able to slow the boat down so that we would not have boat damage in rough weather. So there were times when we would slow the boat down so we wouldn't be pounding into the waves and doing more damage to the rig and so forth.
So if you were offshore, when you were offshore, I mean, what was the biggest waves you saw and where?
We were in gale force winds, storm force winds, off of the coast of Canada.
So how velocity, 50, 60?
Yeah, 50.
And how big a waves?
It's not the size of the wave, it's the steepness of the
How
wave.
big a waves? How big a waves did you see?
Oh, gosh, 20 feet, probably.
And what was your storm mode of sailing? Would you sail down the breeze bare sticks with a drogue aft, or what was your mode?
No, generally we could sail very well with just the main. And so we would often sail with just the main and go kind of into the wind, but not, and make a very slow, steady progress in the direction that we wanted to go.
So was it a double reef, or did you have multiple reefs?
Yeah, with a double reef. We did put in a deeper reef when we were in New Zealand, and we did use it a bit in New Zealand. We had a storm trysail, but we discovered that the deep reef in the main was more helpful than the storm trysail, which was pretty much always in the way, and the track was on the outside, and keeping it lubricated so that it wouldn't get stuck, and then making sure the lead was right was not worth the extra trouble when we could do so well just bringing down the main and going into a real deep reef.
So life on the boat, were you writing in any pattern? Were you writing in the mornings? Did you have a writing habit? What was your pattern?
I wrote updates about everywhere we went. I wrote pretty much every day, and I took notes every day about what we did. And my husband gave me no end of grief, like, what do you need to know what we had for dinner on Tuesday the 27th, But it was surprisingly handy when I was putting together the book, was I could add those details because I had taken those notes, and it helped enrich the story and remind me of all kinds of things that it's easy to forget. And taking lots of pictures as well was really helpful.
So how much a day would you write?
Couple of hours a day.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I wrote articles, and I wrote blog posts and newsletters and so forth, and they kept getting shared and so forth. That was really nice.
So John Bechtel has a question. John.
Yes, I'm wondering if you had a top few go-to meals that you prepared.
Oh yes, one of my go-to meals it tasted like a gourmet item, but it was quite simple. I'd make rice. Like, when in doubt, make rice. I think the first few weeks after I got back, I didn't eat rice for quite a while. So I'd make rice, and then I would open a can of salmon, pour the salmon in, and then I would make chutney, or if I had chutney, of course, it would be wonderful. But if I would make chutney by putting a little bit of butter in a pan, adding a little bit of hot pepper, and then whatever fruit I had that might be rotting up in the forepeak or what have you, or whatever jam I had on board that needed to be finished, and then pour that over everything else. And it was this hearty meal that tasted really gourmet, and your standards actually tend to drop when you're out there at night and it's evening time. So that may not sound real appealing, but it's just so wonderful. Yeah.
Fishing. Did you fish?
We did fish, yeah. We were not the best fishermen ever, but we caught quite a few. We caught a 6.5-foot shark, which was probably not the wisest thing that we ever tried to reel in. But Garth was quite determined to get that lure back. I think it had cost us $2.50 Fijian when we bought it, but, the book was called Tightwads. You kind of get an idea where that comes from. And trying to give it to the locals was a challenge because it was as big as the canoe that they were riding in, and they were wanting to make sure that those jaws were not still moving.
Daru Kawakowski has a question. Daru.
Wendy, speaking of scary things, did you never see a movie called Dead Calm?
Oh,
with Nicole
yes.
Kidman.
Yes.
Was that before or after you did this?
We did that beforehand, and we did not have it upon any abandoned looking boats out there and psycho people. We found incredibly nice people out there and very welcoming. And we had days when we would wake up and somebody would have dropped a gift into the cockpit while we were sleeping. So many times. And we had fishermen just come and hand us fish, and they would be there for so little time. We almost had not enough time to say thank you. They were making it very clear that they wanted us to have this. We were welcome to it, and they didn't expect anything from us. They just would hand us the fish and vanish. And it astounds me, the kind of warmth that we experienced out there. It's just neat.
Now, part of your bio says mother. So at what point did you become a mother, and did that stop the process of sailing
Well,
around?
that's not actually accurate. We did not have kids, so we did not go out with kids. It was Garth's family story that I think led to that.
So on fishing, how often per week did you catch fish? And what did you usually catch?
Well, we would put the line over the side. We had a reel with a leader, and
Did you use a pole or just a line direct?
just a line direct with a little bit of a reel, a hand reel, and then a rubber band. And so when we caught something, the rubber band would break, and we'd hear this twang, and we'd know that there was something on the line. And we didn't always get whatever it was we caught successfully aboard, and sometimes it would be eaten before we could get it aboard. But
By other fish, you mean?
by other fish,
Uh-huh.
yes. But we found that the best fishing is when you're making landfall, when you're near land and places where fish can hide out. And so often you are pretty stressed out trying to make sure that you don't hit anything when making landfall. So we would often bring the lines in right when the best fishing was happening. And some of our friends would make landfall and be ashore for a while, and then they'd go back out fishing. And that was sometimes the better way of making sure you could get. And we caught a lot of fish by smiling and having people give us fish.
So what was the friendliest port you visited?
Would have a terrible time figuring out just one. When we were on our North Pacific Passage, it was 49 days nonstop, and there were not a lot of people to talk to, namely me and Garth. And so we actually created a spreadsheet, and of course we didn't agree on the best place. And we had all this criteria, friendliest people, most convenient grocery store, best sailing, most beautiful scenery, and all that kind of thing. And we didn't agree. Japan ranked very highly on our list as a friendly, generous, warm, welcoming place. The French Polynesian Islands were quite beautiful, but not quite as friendly. Oh, gosh.
So sail repair. Did you repair sails on board? Did Garth do it, or did you? Have
Oh,
him in
yes.
it?
We repaired sails many, many times. We have pictures of us repairing them in Japan on the dock, and we have pictures of us repairing them on the deck.
So he did it himself.
Yeah, we did.
And if you were going to go again, first of all, do you go sailing nowadays? What's your sailing status?
I go racing when I can. Yeah, whenever I get an invitation, I'm happy to go. I love racing. I love going
Great.
out. I love boats, period.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. So you basically have overall positive memories about the whole experience. You didn't come
Oh,
back.
yeah,
with-
I'm aching to go again. Oh, yeah. So we're building a boat, and when we're done building the boat, our plan is to take off and do some exploring once again, go see some parts of the world we haven't seen. And
Wonderful. Well, our guest today at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the St. Francis Yacht Club, has been none other than the authoress, Wendy Hinman. She's got 2 books, which you can buy right here at the front desk in the grill room, and online at Amazon.
Amazon,
And
my
Amazon.
website, and all sorts of bookstores.
And these are great award-winning books that she's written. And so, Wendy, it's been really, really wonderful having you as a guest at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much for
It's been
sharing
really
your story
fun.
with us. And with that, the luncheon's adjourned. Nikki, look at our time. Real close to the right on the money. So I'm surprised we didn't have more